There we go.
All right. So welcome everyone to Bill's presentation tonight. And I think you've all, since you're here, you know what it's about, trade policy dilemmas. He's going to present 2 case studies for us. And Bill, once again, is a senior advisor and economist. What was a senior advisor and chair, right? Scholl Chair.
Yes.
Sure, if you want to.
Of the Center of Strategic and International Studies. And if you're not already on mute, put yourself on mute so we can hear Bill well. And I'll put myself on mute after I finish yapping and open us with a brief word of prayer. We give you thanks, great God of all grace and Lord of all love. We give you thanks that there are so many gifted persons in our congregation, our friends and members alike, such as Bill, who bring us from their work, their deep commitment to the public good, the common weal, and to your beloved community, to which you have sent us, each of us, and guide us in our daily world to be about. In a world full of so much self-centeredness and selfishness, let us be open now to your spirit as Bill shares it with us and as we discuss among ourselves. What are the best ways to carry forth your good news in the world? In Christ's name, amen. Bill, State of the Union address, 4th or 5th summer in a row. What has it been? I think it's the 4th summer.
I don't remember. I lose track. You get to be my age, you don't remember things. So I would say 3, maybe 4. I don't know.
I think it's 4. We've had you at La Madeleine 3 times, I think. Or actually, last year we had you here in Zoom. We have a
I guess
Zoom.
have they closed for good now? Are they gone?
I think they would plan to close, but I do not know. I do not know. So,
I've driven past there a number of times, but I've not thought to look. I mean, I'm not sure how you could tell from the outside whether it was closed for the day or closed permanently. But
well, it's a wonderful place, but we have enough with trade policy dilemmas right now, so you're on.
well, thank you, and thank you for having me. This is not going to be a presentation. I hope it's going to be a discussion, and so I really want to hear from all of you about what you think. I did this a couple of weeks ago with a group of our interns, mostly, and interns and junior staff. And there were a lot more of them. It was a bigger group. And so we voted. And we rolled out some fancy software that allowed everybody to vote and then had little bar graphs. And I decided not to do that, partly because I'm not sure I could operate it. And it's kind of complicated, especially if something goes wrong, it diverts attention. So I think we'll just have a discussion, but maybe we'll have a vote at the end. We'll see what you think. What I wanted to do is talk about 2 cases that pose kind of dilemmas for policy makers as they try to decide what the right answer is and what the thing to do is. And both of them, I think, involve, I'm not sure I can define the term, but they involve sort of moral issues where policymakers kind of have to sort out what they're trying to accomplish, and they have to, or they don't have to, but they ought to take into account the side effects of whatever it is they're doing. Because one of the things I learned in my business, sort of international economics, is there's always side effects, and they're usually they're not always intended. And when I was in the government, we would issue a rule about something, and invariably 6 months later, somebody would come in and say, "How could you do that? You put me out of business." And I would say, "Well, where were you when we were doing it? You know, we had a comment period. You could have weighed in. You could have said all these things." And the answer is always, "Well, I didn't know about it." which was probably true, but it's not really possible to anticipate everything that might possibly happen. But I think the challenge for people that have to make these decisions is to try to anticipate as much as you can, and then sort out, I think, sort of the costs and benefits, and who is paying the costs, and who is receiving the benefits, because that's often what a lot of it is about. So what I was going to do is, I think we'll have time for two. Probably if we have a really good discussion, maybe we won't, but I'll probably cut it off after the first half hour, and then we'll do the second one. And I'm going to make a short little presentation of what the issue is. And then I want you all to sort of tell me two things. One is, what do you think is the right answer? And there isn't a right answer. There's just opinions. So you don't have to worry about being wrong. There's no wrong. But related to that is, what do you need to know that you don't know in order to make a more informed answer to the first question? Because one of the issues with these things always is there enough information to make an informed judgment about what you're going to do? And if there isn't, can you get it? And do you want to wait for it? Or is it important to make a decision right away because lives are at stake, or because of there's some other consequences that are at stake? So there's all these things you have to weigh. So the first one is sanctions on Myanmar. I assume you all sort of know what happened in Myanmar. There was a military coup earlier this year in February that overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi, and the more or less civilian government arrested them, and the military stepped back in and is now running the country. This is actually the second time that's happened. And the last time, the first time it happened, the United States did impose sanctions. And in the end, the military ultimately allowed civilians in to take over the government. That took probably 10 years, maybe, for that to happen. So it wasn't like there was a military coup, the United States did something, and 3 months later, the soldiers gave up. It took a long time for them to decide, the military to decide, that they wanted to sort of re-enter the community of normal nations. So, here we are again. The same thing has happened, and the United States has the same set of choices. So what they've decided to do, and I've got some notes here, bear with me while I refer to my notes. On 9 different times since February, the United States has imposed different sets of sanctions on various individuals and groups in Myanmar. They began with sanctions against 10 former and current military officials, sanctions against various companies that are in the gemstone and jewelry industry, because that's really the biggest industry in Myanmar. I think $31 billion worth of gemstones annually, which is a lot of money in Myanmar. Subsequently, they imposed sanctions on additional individuals and on some entities, including the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Home Affairs. And in a country like Myanmar, there are basically state-owned corporations that are run, in this case, by the military, but they are companies that are engaged in normal commercial activity. They make stuff, they buy stuff, they sell stuff that has nothing to do with the military, but they're owned by the military. So the Myanmar Economic Corporation, which is operated by the Ministry of Defense, was sanctioned, and the Myanmar Economic Holding Limited Company was sanctioned by the Ministry of Defense. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what the sanctions were. They also sanctioned, or we also sanctioned, the adult children of the commander-in-chief of the Myanmar Armed Forces, and also 6 companies that those children own, including a restaurant, an art gallery, and several other, a construction company, and several others. It's not immediately clear what they do. At least two are probably in some form of retail. And then they sanctioned several divisions of the Burmese army, and also sanctioned two military holding companies, the Myanmar Economic Holdings Public Company United, which is in the banking, logistics, construction, tourism, agriculture, tobacco, food, and beverage businesses, but it's owned by the military. And another one called the Myanmar Economic Corporation Limited, which is a holding company that is in the mining, manufacturing, and telecommunications sectors, as well as owning companies that supply natural resources to the military, which I think means oil, and operates the factories that produce goods the military uses. So a lot of sanctions, and there were more, but I'm not going to bore you with all 11 days worth, but they followed the same kinds of things. More individuals that are engaged in the coup that took over the government, more military entities, more government entities, and more companies that are owned by the military. The sanctions tended to be on individuals, freezing of assets. So if you had a bank account here, you couldn't get the money out. It was frozen, and prohibiting any transactions with those parties. So if you owed them money, you didn't have to pay them. If they owed you money, they couldn't pay you because banks wouldn't be allowed to engage in those transactions. So virtually all commercial activity with the sanctioned entities was prohibited. They were put on various government lists that mostly restrict US exports to those places. So if you wanted to export to any of those companies, you would have to get a license from the US government, and those licenses would probably be denied. So they're fairly tough sanctions as these things go. Several other factoids. The EU has done some similar things, but they haven't gone as far as the United States has. And the biggest difference is that they have not imposed sanctions on the military government directly. We've done that, and the British have done that, but the EU has not. Also noteworthy, though, is that Myanmar's two biggest trading partners, who are China and Thailand, have not done anything and have not imposed any sanctions. The largest foreign investor in Myanmar, Singapore, has rejected demands that they impose sanctions. So they haven't done anything. And the other Southeast Asian nations, in other words, the neighbors, haven't imposed any sanctions either. So the sanctions are largely entirely from Western developed countries. And so that's where things sit. The things to keep in mind, I think, is that, and why this is an interesting dilemma, is that while all these enterprises that have been sanctioned are owned by the bad guys, the military officials, particularly the senior officials that were responsible for the coup, they all have actual normal people who work there, people who mine for emeralds and rubies, or fish for pearls, or people that work in the restaurants, or people that make apparel. Making clothing is a big Myanmar industry. There are estimates that because of these sanctions, Myanmar will lose $5.5 billion, billion with a B, in foreign investment. That there was a survey taken of 10 foreign chambers of commerce in Myanmar. And that survey reported that 13% of the companies had stopped all their business activity in Myanmar since the coup. And a third of the companies reported at least a 75% reduction in their activity. So there is an impact. The economy is gradually winding down, which is pretty much what happened the last time. And there was a study done when the EU was considering similar sanctions in 2019, which they did not impose, but there was a study done anyway. And the study concluded that the textile industry in Myanmar would have lost as many as 450,000 jobs within 4 years if the sanctions had gone into place. So there are significant consequences for everybody, not just the owners and the elite, but also the workers. Pro-democracy groups in Myanmar have urged more sanctions. They've also urged military intervention against the regime, which I think is unlikely, but certainly at least on the part of the United States. And so that's where it stands. You've got the West imposing sanctions. You've got the neighbors and their biggest traders not doing that. You've got the question of what will happen if Western companies leave. Do they just leave a hole, or do the Chinese come in and fill the gap? That's kind of an unanswered question. So that's sort of what's going on. I have got more information, but I'll stop there and ask you guys to weigh in. And so I think the big questions are the ones I framed in the first place, but we can start a little bit smaller, which is, what do you think the objectives of the sanctions are? What do you think the United States in particular wants to accomplish here in an ideal world?
If you share, make sure you take yourself off mute so we know you're sharing.
Yeah, I don't think we need to do raise hands or anything. If somebody wants to talk, just go ahead and talk. But
okay, one of my thoughts is because this is the second time that the military has taken over, there was the intermediary civil government,
right.
but if I recall correctly, that had really soured and gotten very vicious. Am I correct in that understanding? Because if we're trying to put it back into the people's hands, and the example of putting it in the people's hands is a government that has betrayed its voters, it's useful to know.
That's a really interesting question, and I'm intrigued. When I did this with the CSIS staff, nobody brought that up. I think there are two answers. There was an election last November. In fact, the purpose of the coup leaders said that their purpose was because the election was fraudulent, they were going to overturn the election results. The election results were overwhelming support for the civilian government that you were just talking about. They captured, I think, almost all the seats in the parliament. So one answer to your question is the civilian government had significant popularity. The other answer to your question, though, is that the civilian government had compiled a record of persecution of the Rohingya minority, which is the Muslim minority that lives in the western part of Myanmar, right on the Indian border. There's a long, complicated history there, and but I think it's probably fair to say that most Burmese don't regard them as citizens and don't think they should be there. I mean, they have no other place to go, but that's so. And the government, including Aung San Suu Kyi, who was widely praised initially when she came in, has been criticized for not addressing that problem in a humane way. in fact, promoting further discrimination against the Rohingya. So yes, there is something to that, but I think the dilemma, which is inside Myanmar, is what she did, which was unpopular here, and which was probably, evidence of some human rights abuses, was probably popular amongst the rest of the country.
Thank you.
So other thoughts, what are we trying to do?
So, yeah, so if the alternative is to not impose sanctions, and that suggests that we would be condoning the military takeover. That's not a happy option. We don't want to send a message that, oh, well, that's unfortunate, but it's totally fine with us, whatever,
Well, that raises an interesting question. Is the purpose, I mean, this is opinion, do you think the purpose is to send a message, or is the purpose, send a message that we disapprove, or is the purpose to actually change something?
I mean, I guess that there are other ways to send messages. I mean, this is sending a message through, economic harm. We think this is so bad, we're going to, harm your economy. At least we hope to through this. And there's other, yeah. I mean, how efficacious is it? Could you do express objections that what I think they used to do in the UN, where you would have some type of speech that would say we condemn this, and people would pay attention. But that doesn't happen anymore, and so the sanctions seem to be what the path of choice for the last several years to express a government's, especially U.S. Objection to some, a very significant objection. It's not used.
I think we've done that. I think we've done it at the UN. There have been some meetings at the UN Security Council. I don't think that they were able to pass a resolution because I think China vetoed it.
Maybe that's why they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, but that is another approach. But that, I mean, that is sort of deciding that you're not likely to be able to change anything, but that it's still important to send a message, right?
How long will it take these sanctions to really impact the citizenry? Is the message that we don't like this government takeover, and therefore we will do what economic harm we can until the citizenry decides to take it into their own hands?
That's a good question. And I don't know that there's a clear answer to it. I mean, as the last time we went through this, it took like 10 years before anything changed, but that didn't mean that there was no impact for that period of time. It just means that the military held on. I think the answer probably depends a little bit on what the Chinese do and what the Thais do, because we've sanctioned these companies. We've made it more difficult for them to do business. We're not buying their apparel anymore. We're not buying their gemstones. But if somebody else is, then it may not make any difference. It just changes, the buyer changes, but the transaction still goes through. I think it's too early to say. I gave you some data about there's an expectation that there will be a significant drop in foreign investment in Myanmar. And my guess is that that will be true not only of US investment, but probably Chinese investment too, because people don't like uncertainty. They don't like turmoil. And if you don't know what's going to happen, then you keep your money in your wallet and, you know, and stay away from the country. So I think there probably will be a significant decline in investment, which means they stop growing, really, stop developing. But it may take a while before you see before thousands of people lose their jobs because there's no longer a market for their products. And that would be the most significant impact, I think.
But wouldn't it be an advantage for China if there is this hole to fill the vacuum and expand as it's trying to do in other places?
I'm sorry, say the beginning again.
Wouldn't it be to China's advantage if there is this hole or this vacuum for them to fill it so they can expand their loans and their influence like they've been trying in other places?
It might be. I think they have the same, everybody has the same dilemma. That would be tempting for them. At the same time, that would mean they're associating themselves with a military regime that has been widely condemned throughout most of the world. I mean, even countries that didn't impose sanctions have condemned what's happening. And they'd be supporting, the Chinese have maintained, I mean, I don't know if anybody believes them, but their position is that they don't interfere in other countries' affairs. And here they would be directly supporting a group that overthrew the government. That would cost them something in world public opinion. That would be the other side of the argument. But it would also be, I think, probably to their economic advantage to fill the holes that we would be leaving.
The Chinese also have that whole issue with the Muslim Uyghurs. So, you know, what we look at as an atrocity is perhaps no more than a reflection of how China feels about these people.
That may be. It was tempting to put that one on the list of things to discuss, but I decided to go with Myanmar rather than the Uyghurs. We can talk about the Uyghurs another time. It's the issues are not quite the same, but they both reflect persecution of Muslim minorities. There's no question about that.
Both sides of the government, both the military and the civilian government.
In Myanmar?
Yeah.
Yes, there's not really, the way they treat the Rohingya, I don't think there's a significant difference.
Okay, so who are really the bad people in this overthrow?
Well, there's one primary bad person, and his name is Minong. I can't pronounce Burmese. Minong Hwang. He is the head general. He's the chief of the commander-in-chief of the military forces. And there is a theory that this has more to do with him being personally upset and being very stubborn than anything else. But now the rest of the military is following his lead. But I think, one issue is if he disappeared tomorrow, would anything change? And I mean, we don't know that, but that would be a possibility.
Well, I guess
Do you believe in
comment.
dictatorial aspirations? I'm
Pardon
talking
me?
to somebody else.
Kevin, go ahead.
Do you believe this person has dictatorial aspirations, this general?
Yeah, I think that would be a good, yes, I think that would be right.
That's what I thought.
Well, let me offer a different perspective. I think the United States and even Great Britain and the European Union have a moral responsibility. So it transcends politics and economics. I still don't think we should go along with the rest of the world. I mean, the Chinese and the Soviets and the Iranians and all of that don't have the same moral values we have.
Oh, really?
And I just think that that element needs to be put into the equation.
Okay, anybody want to react to that?
I agree with it.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's-
Bill, just a question as to why, you know, the prior regime was, you know, had human rights abuses, and so was not favored, although it was democratically elected. So you have a coup. I mean, coups happen in countries. So why is this one particularly bad? That, you know, the United States feels that sanctions are appropriate. You know, that the military, you know, replaces a democratically elected, you know, I mean, it happens, but again, it's sort of a part of U.S. government policy to say, and we think, you know, the military shouldn't, you know, should step down and use sanctions to bring that about.
Well, we say that, I mean, the US position historically has generally been to support elected governments. And when one is overthrown, we usually condemn the people that are doing the overthrowing and support the democratically elected government, whether we like it or not. But you know, but we don't always do everything that we've done. You know, you can impose lots of sanctions or not. I guess one of the differences, this was particularly blatant and particularly quick. And it's also one we've seen before. So there was a feeling that, I guess, the feeling that it was appropriate to take strong action. And, you know, this happened in the Biden administration, so not a leftover from Trump. And this president has very strong views on human rights issues. I think he would agree with the moral comment that was made a couple minutes ago, and he's the one that makes these decisions at the end. I mean, the question there is, which is sort of the theme of all this, is there are, notwithstanding what's the right word, the moral imperative of doing something, there are consequences. There's a lot of collateral damage to ordinary people that are innocent. So that's the question that people have to think about. I can sanction General Huang's companies, and that will hurt him, no question. I can freeze all of his assets, and if he stashed them in a Swiss bank, we can probably do something about that, and he probably has. So yeah, this will have an impact, but the consequence of that may be that tens of thousands of Burmese women that make clothing are going to lose their jobs. And so the question, you know, that for you to think about is, it's the theme of the title of this, is the juice worth the squeeze? You know, is it worth doing this? Is it worth squeezing it? Are you going to get enough out of it to warrant the damage that you're causing otherwise innocent people? Or is the moral imperative more important that you simply have to lay that aside? This is why Biden gets the big bucks. He has to make those decisions. Anybody want to make a comment? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one and confuse you even more.
Well, Bill, I just want to lift up the article that you just referenced, and that colorful metaphor is the juice worth the squeeze. This is an example of the articles that Bill sends out every Monday, right? Tuesday?
Usually Monday or Tuesday.
Tuesday. And if you go back and look, I can put the link in the chat in a moment. But this whole hour in many ways is based on principles that came out of this article, would you say?
Yeah.
And, so I do want to give you a plug.
Well, thank you. I shouldn't admit it, but the juice and the squeeze issue was a quote It's probably older than this, but I got it from a movie. And this is embarrassing. It's an R-rated movie called The Girl Next Door, which is not a movie that I would particularly recommend to anybody. But the basic plot is it's a kind of a coming of age movie. The basic plot is a teenage boy who discovers to his surprise that his new next door neighbor is an ex-porn star. And then the movie sort of goes downhill from there. But the quote comes from that. But I think it's apt. One of the dilemmas that governments have is, it's easy to say, we need to squeeze these people because they've done something wrong. And there's not a lot of dispute that they've done something wrong. And there's not a lot of dispute that they should be squeezed. But, the process of squeezing has a lot of consequences. And so then the question is, do you take those into account? Or is there an imperative here that's more important than that? Let me turn then to the other one.
Bill, I just wanted to just one thing, just
Yeah, go ahead.
and sort of sanctions run counter to the Western view that economic engagement is a way to foster, economic growth and democracy.
Yes.
And so, that has been a decades old, point of view.
That's a corollary, because the idea then is, of course, if you take that away, then you might be able to influence them. And the idea is that, Myanmar was beginning to integrate itself into the global economy under the civilian government, because the last military government really isolated the country. Most people simply cut them off and just didn't do business with them, and they just sort of sat there and stagnated. And not a lot of people noticed, but when the civilian government came in, then it has attractions for investment. There are industries there. If you're in the jewelry business, Myanmar is a big deal. There aren't a lot of places that have emeralds and rubies, trust me. And they do. They got a lot of teak and other rare woods too. And that raises the whole question about exploitation of, tropical forests. But it's not a country that is poor in natural resources. But I think a lot of that will come to a halt as a result of the sanctions until they change their mind, if they change their mind. The other development I should mention that's different this time than the last time is there does seem to be armed resistance. There have not only been demonstrators in the cities and rioting in the cities, but there's been armed militias trying to kill the soldiers, mostly around the edges of the country. And there's a long history of that anyway. There are a number of it's a country of multiple ethnic groups, and not all of the ethnic groups have historically been happy to be in the country. They have a whole set of grievances against every central government that's been there. So it's not hard to get a rebellion started in Myanmar against whoever's in charge. But this is a case where there seems to be more of that going on than the last time. And more soldiers are getting shot and more civilians are getting shot. And there's a lot of them that are being arrested and put on trial. The last coup was quieter, I guess would be the best way to put it. Well, let me turn to the other subject, because the other subject, the good guys and the bad guys are a little bit harder to figure out. It raises some different issues, but also it's also kind of a life and death thing. And that's the vaccine waiver discussion. And so for background, most pharmaceuticals, drugs, vaccines are patented. because the people that invented them, who spent in many cases billions of dollars designing and creating them, want to protect their investment. That's why we have a patent system. And patents in the United States last usually 20 or so years, I forget the exact number. And then after that, the patent lapses, and anybody can make the product, assuming they have the technology. So this is why you have a generic drug market. The generic drugs in the United States are all drugs where the patents have lapsed. And then prices go down because the generics sell them at a cheaper price and the original manufacturer lowers its price. But they get that 20-year or so period of protection and higher prices, which allows them to recoup their enormous R&D investment. I mean, that's sort of the way the system works. You can be for that or against it, but that's kind of the way it works most everywhere. When we were forming the World Trade Organization in 1994 and before, there was a debate about this because there were some countries that said there are circumstances, poor countries, developing countries that said there are circumstances where we want to be able to produce drugs to save lives in our country, but we can't afford to pay the high fees that the Western companies are charging. We want to be able to basically break the patents and authorize our own production in our country. And there was a big debate about this amongst the nations. And in the end, they decided to allow that under certain limited conditions. So they created what is called a TRIPS waiver. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Intellectual Property. I don't know that the S stands for anything, but it's there's a TRIPS agreement, which is part of the WTO. And it says that under certain limited circumstances, countries can essentially break a patent and authorize domestic production of whatever it was that was patented on their own. This has only happened a very small number of times. The most prominent example is that about 15, 20 years ago, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe did it for HIV/AIDS drugs in order to bring those drugs to a population where there was an epidemic and reduced costs so people could get those drugs and save their lives. It's a process that's not used very often, and it's very specific for, you can only do it for like one patent at a time. And if you're talking about COVID vaccines, there's a lot of patents involved. So what happened is there's two countries in particular, India and South Africa, have argued that that procedure that I just described isn't fast enough and it isn't good enough in the current case because we have an epidemic. And so there should be a special waiver for vaccines that will allow them to produce them regardless of the intellectual property rights that Western companies hold. Now, what the South Africans and Indians have proposed is a waiver not just for vaccines, but for also associated diagnostics, therapeutics, medical devices, personal protective equipment, their materials or components, and their methods and means of manufacture for the prevention, treatment, or containment of COVID-19. So they proposed a very, very broad waiver. And their initial proposal was to make it, it didn't have an endpoint. It was kind of permanent. Even though there's a provision in the WTO that says that anytime you do this, it has to be time limited. The provision doesn't say what time it has to be, but it says there has to be an endpoint. And this initially didn't have one. So in the beginning, what happened is the Indians and South Africans wanted to do this. The developed countries, which include, not all of them, but include the countries that make the relevant drugs, objected, as you might imagine. And this issue was deadlocked throughout most of last year. Just to put it in context, 90% there's a difference here between value and volume. 90% of the value of global vaccines are produced by just 4 companies. GlaxoSmithKline, which is a UK company, Merck and Pfizer, which are US companies, and Sanofi, which is a French company. However, 60% of the volume that's produced, which means also low end in part, is produced by 5 companies. Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline are 2 of those, but the other 3 are from India. SII, BBIL, and Halfkind are Indian companies, and India is already a major producer of generic drugs, and in this case, vaccines. So there's been a debate, and the United States stepped in the Biden administration, changed the US policy, which had been to oppose the waiver, defending our companies, who opposed the waiver. And the United States announced in April that it was going to support a waiver for vaccine only. And the implication was it would not support a waiver for PPE and medical devices and all of the other stuff that was included in the original proposal, but they would support a waiver just for the vaccine. They did so because they're under heavy pressure from the progressive part of the Democratic Party to do this for multiple reasons. One, because they think that it will enable more vaccine to get to poorer people faster and thereby save lives. And they think that the progressives tend to think that the large American drug companies are making enormous profits at the expense of people dying, and they want to take that ability away from them. The other side has argued that granting the waiver won't produce the result that is being sought, that these vaccines, the Pfizer one and the Merck one in particular, use new technologies that are very difficult to replicate, and that the countries that want to benefit from the waiver don't have either the technology or the equipment to produce it. And so, in other words, we could do the waiver and it wouldn't make any difference. It's basically the argument. And so where it sits right now is the United States change of position kind of transformed the debate, and more or less the country, if you're going to do this, the WTO has to agree to it, which means all 164 countries that belong to the WTO have to agree. And the way it works is they don't have to all vote yes, but nobody can vote no. So it's like the term is consensus, not unanimity. So there's a meeting and the proposition we put, and if nobody stands up and says no, then it's done. So a lot of countries simply won't say anything, and they'll let it happen. But as long as there's an objector, nothing will happen. But what the United States was able to do is to basically get all the countries to agree to talk about it and to have a negotiation. India and South Africa put forward a revised proposal, which was not that different from the original one, but it did make some adjustments. And they're now debating that, and they're meeting every week to do that. They've made virtually no progress so far. EU countries continue to be opposed. I think primarily EU countries are opposed. Japan has and some other Asian countries have come around after the United States did. I think China says it supports a waiver. India, of course, proposed it. So the lines are kind of drawn here. And the likely outcome will be in November, which is when all the countries meet. They have every 2 years, they have a ministerial meeting. And so that's like the action forcing event. You can agree beforehand, but it's unlikely that people will agree beforehand. So it looks like it'll be the end of November. So there it sits. And so the question is, You know, and this may be one where you need more information, but did the United States do the right thing? And, you know, some people will say, yeah, we did the right thing because there's a moral imperative here. We need to help people and we need to save lives. The other side says, well, sure, but you're not saving any lives because this isn't going to make any difference. There's other people who will say this was a cynical Machiavellian move on the part of the United States because it got them great good publicity in developing countries who are very happy that we said that. But the United States knows that one of two things will happen. Either the Europeans will continue to object, and so they'll be the bad guys and not us. And so we get a PR benefit. But you know, our companies don't lose. Or if that doesn't happen, it's going to take so long to negotiate actual language that the pandemic will be over by the time they reach an agreement and it won't matter. So that's a cynical explanation of what happened. So questions for you are, what's the right answer? And are there more things you need to know before you can have an opinion on the right answer?
Have the drug companies recovered their initial investment costs, considering all the vaccines that have been used in the US and up to this point?
A very good question. And I don't know the answer. My guess is yes, although because they're getting paid. I mean, you don't have to pay for it, but if those of you that are vaccinated, you didn't have to pay for it when you got the shot. But somebody paid Pfizer, somebody paid Merck, somebody paid J&J. Usually the U.S. government or maybe your health plan, it would depend. But my guess is they will recoup their investment, but they might not admit that. Generally speaking, I was listening to someone this morning about this. I mean, this is an unusual case because they did an extraordinary thing in a very short period of time. I mean, normally developing something like this takes years and costs billions of dollars. And the companies did this in what, less than a year. It's an extraordinary effort, and it probably cost them a lot of money. And my guess is they'll do very nicely and get it back. Evelyn.
Who is our representative to those negotiations? Is this someone who understands the drug industry, or is it a politician?
It's the people that, well, right now it's a career government official, but the responsible party is the U.S. Trade Representative, her name is Catherine Tai, and she's an a Biden appointee, and she, I'm an admirer of Catherine's because, like me, she worked on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
She worked for the House Ways and Means Committee before this job, so she had a big bump up in status. She went from staff, to the top of the food chain by this appointment. I would not say that she's an expert on pharmaceuticals, no, but she has been diligent in meeting with all the relevant parties in this case. She has met and talked to all of the pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing vaccines. She's also met and talked to the other side that supports the waiver. She's been very diligent in doing that.
So Bill, here's a question for facts. What about the Russians and Sputnik 5 and whatever the Chinese vaccine is? Do they have a view on this? Is that
the Chinese support a waiver? I believe the Russians do too, but I'm not sure about that. The main opponents are European countries, the EU.
I heard an interesting advertisement on the radio today. It was on WTOP, which doesn't usually play political ads like this, but some company or some organization calling themselves One America, I think, they were supporting this ad, urging people to write to the White House to prevent the US from allowing our enemies to share this vaccine technology. And they specifically mentioned Russia and China, which to me seemed sort of strange because Russia and China have their own vaccines. But anyway, it was just weird.
No,
I
I'm
found
glad,
it very weird.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's important. One of the arguments that's being made by the opponents of the waiver is what you've just described, and that's a group that apparently reflects that view, which is that if you're going to have a waiver, what the result of the waiver is you're going to make this proprietary technology available to other people. And if you, the logic is if you do that, eventually it will end up in the hands of the Chinese and the Russians. Not that because we're going to give it to them, but you know, it'll be given to the South Africans and the Indians and others, and then it will end up in other people's hands. And that would be bad. Evelyn?
How would it be if we negotiated in this talk that we are willing to do that as long as the product is available to the general public at no cost?
That could be one way to do it, yes. And there's some evidence that that would be a good thing to do, because when this has happened in the past, you know, I said I had examples of some prior waivers that were granted. One of the issues there is there was some evidence in some of these countries, probably Zimbabwe, that the drugs did not actually end up in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
That they were sold in third markets and the money went into dictators' Swiss bank accounts. So what you're talking about would be probably a very wise thing to do.
Well, you can tell them I said it's okay.
I don't think they listened to me, but okay, thank you. Diana, do you want to say something?
Well, I think Evelyn's idea is a really good one. I know that would create a huge administrative issue to follow up that would have to be dealt with. Part of my other thoughts were, I know some of the vaccines, if I understood correctly, were supported by grants under Trump administration for development, and that the Pfizer one was not. I don't know whether Germany supported it or what.
Holland, the Netherlands.
Yeah, there are rules about that in the United States. Rules about who owns the fruits of research if it's government funded. For those of you that are wonky, it's called the Bayh-Dole Act, named after Senator Dole and Senator Birch Bayh, who was a senator in the 60s and 70s. And it has been credited with stimulating a lot more research, because what it said was if you're a university or I guess a company that's taken federal money to do your research, that research, you can use that research and you can keep the fruits of that research. The money doesn't go back to the government, which is the way it operated before Bayh-Dole. And so before this act was passed, researchers didn't have a big incentive to develop anything because the government got all the revenue. But thanks to this law, now if you're a scientist and you get a government grant and you come up with some wonderful thing, you get to keep the money that you can make from it. And that's been an enormous boon to research and development in this country for 30 years. It's an old act, it goes back to the 80s. I don't know the situation in Europe, how it works in Europe.
Do you know, can you help us understand where the drug corporations in India are in terms of their production and cost and doing the scientific correct thing rather than using inexpensive substitutes that are not always acceptable scientific substitutes?
I don't have a lot to say about that. I think that India has long been one of the largest producers of generic medicines. They've got the equipment, they've got the trained workforce, they've got the technology to do it. There are ironies there because they're having this huge surge they had this huge surge of cases. And I think in retrospect, they made a mistake in that they thought that was not going to happen to them. And they did a very generous thing early in the pandemic, which is they shipped a lot of their vaccine to other countries. But the result of that was when the wave hit India, they were short. And they've continued to be short. So they have the capacity. I think the issue there, though, is that as I said, the Merck and Pfizer vaccine, not Merck, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines use a new technology that I'm not sure the Indians have. And so that's what would be provided if this waiver were granted. Now they could probably gear up fairly quickly because they've got the infrastructure. And that's the difference. I mean, one of the issues that has not been talked about a lot here is, not every country is going to be able to take advantage of a waiver because if you're Zimbabwe, you probably don't have the infrastructure
Right.
to develop your own production capability. India and South Africa probably do, and they're the ones that are pushing this. But I mean, the related issue is what's known, and some of you know this from other areas, is called the last mile problem. So you may have seen pictures of, the United States donated a lot of vaccine to India at one point. And there were pictures in the paper and on TV of this enormous cargo 747 landing in Delhi and pallet after pallet of vaccine being unloaded. But from the US point of view, that was the last thing you saw. And what nobody paid any attention to is what happens when it leaves the airport? Where does it go? And how does it get to villages 300 kilometers away? And who is there to provide the injections? And some of these, as you know, have to be kept in cold storage at extremely cold temperatures. Do they have the last mile of infrastructure to get it from the arrival point, which might be a port or might be an airport, out into the places where people actually are? And the waiver issue doesn't really address that.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, we're kind of at the end of the time. I don't.
Yeah. Sure.
The point was not. I don't think the point was to reach agreement. I think the point was. I mean, maybe you all agree, but I think the point was to just point out some of the difficulties and the dilemma for the United States here is, and I didn't make it as clear as I could, but if you're Pfizer, you're going to say this is going to cut into our revenue, and while this is probably we've probably made money on it, the issue is not how much money we made on the vaccine. The issue is how much money we're going to make so we can develop the next one. And I had listened to a very interesting presentation this morning from somebody who actually used to work for Pfizer, but doesn't anymore, but he's still in the business, who said something that if you think about it, it's obvious, but it never occurred to me. He said, there's a lot of complaints here about high drug prices in the United States. He said, the reason is basically we have high drug prices in the United States because we're supporting the R&D capabilities of our companies. And other countries have very low prices because they have price controls and they force the prices low. But the result is that if they have pharmaceutical companies, they starve them of R&D money. And most of the R&D in the pharmaceutical sector is done in the United States. Less now than 20 years ago, but still, the bulk of it is done here. And you all are paying for it. We all are paying for it in higher drug prices. On the other hand, the result is, we get the drugs and the new ones are developed. So one of the trade-offs here is, does that matter? If we are taking money away from the companies in the interest of saving lives in poor countries. We've saved a lot of lives in poor countries. What have we done about the creation of vaccines or drugs to deal with the next pandemic 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Or is that something we should worry about then and not something we should worry about now? Those are the kinds of arguments the industry makes. They also make the quality control argument that in this country, you can have confidence that the shot you got is the vaccine and that it was administered by a sterile needle and a nurse practitioner or medic who knew what they were doing. If you're going to make these in countries that don't have any of those procedures in place, you're going to get a lot of fraud. There's already cases of fake vaccines being sold in various countries. And that the more places you authorize to produce, the more that's going to happen. So that's another argument on the other side.
And there are constant transactional dynamics, and how do we get to transformation out of all these transactions? We have to have a revolution in Myanmar and make sure India gets a lot of vaccines. That's just, so just like that.
Well,
thank you very much, Bill, for covering this once again. And so delighted you're here. Ed.
Yeah.
There? Good. Close us with a brief prayer.
You're on the spot, Ed.
Almighty and ever blessed God, we give you thanks for the resources and knowledge and skills and talents that are evident in the people on this Zoom call. We ask that you would further your cause through each of us in the decisions we make and the work that we do. For we ask it in Jesus' name, amen.
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 We'll see many of you Sunday, and you should have an email in your box when you get off of there that's been automatically dropped in your box at 8 o'clock. So thank you, Bill, and make sure you get Bill's article on Tuesdays.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Chuck.
See you again.
All right. Thanks, Bill.
Godspeed.
Chuck,
Yes, Kevin.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you still having Bible study on Saturday?
We certainly are.
Because you mentioned Sunday, but not Saturday. So I'm gonna.
Yeah, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock,
Okay.
but not the following 2 Sundays because I'm away. Yeah, but this Sunday, yes. I mean, Saturday. This Saturday.
Okay.
Definitely. All right.
Send me the link regardless.
Oh, of course you'll get the link. Everybody gets it on Friday.
Thank you.
You bet. Bill, happy
And-
birthday. We didn't sing happy birthday to Bill. Oh, man. Oh, Bill.
Yes.
Let's sing happy birthday. The remaining people here.
Yeah.
Happy birthday
Birthday.
to you. Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to you.
to you.
Happy
Happy
birthday,
birthday,
dear Bill.
Bill.
Uh,
Happy birthday to you.
Oh, that was wonderful and terrible at the same time. Oh, Bill, I wish I'd remembered at the beginning. Oh, that's great. Did you get my email, right?
Yes, I did. Thank you. It was amazing.
It was
William saying happy birthday.
uh,
I can imagine just being in that studio all week, 10 hours a day, singing happy birthday hundreds of times to people with different names.
No, they didn't. No, he didn't. That's all through. Yeah, you know that. You know they do that. All right. All right. God bless you all.
That was
See you Saturday, Chuck.
See you then. See you all
Peace.
Saturday. Bye-bye.
Peace.